Lloyd Favell, Grotowski from the Cree family, Theater and Ritual in the Theatrical Method of work of Lloyd Favell. In 2018 and 2019, I traveled with a group of researchers associated with the University of Katowice to Poundmaker Cree Nation, a reserve located near Cat Knife in Canada, to meet with the local community. Over the years, dealing with the search for the tradition, language and culture of the inhabitants of Upper Silesia, located in the southern part of Poland, I was very interested in working on preserving the indigenous culture of the Cree nation. When Professor Eugenia Sojka invited me to take part in the trip, here I would like to thank much for this possibility. She told me about the local director, a theoretician of theater, who tries to recreate the culture and language of the local First Nation by means of theater. I met Lloyd Favell for the first time in the middle of the night at the edge of the reserve, pushing a car that drove off the roadside and got stuck in the pouring rain. After the night escaped, when we arrived at Floyd's house, I exchanged a few words. He invited us to the first workshop that took place over the next days of our stay in the reserve. I knew about Floyd's way of work, that he was searching for an original method of theater for translating the culture of the indigenous people of North America into the language of theater. The method includes songs, the Indian character language, and is based on the Lakota winter count pictographic system. He calls his method native performance culture. The indigenous theater method, which uses the ritual as a source of inspiration, resembles the assumption of Jerzy Grotowski, of whom Lloyd Favell was a student. Grotowski, looking for a relationship between theater and ritual, writes, "I believe that since it was the primal rites that brought the theater into existence, then by returning to the ritual, in which there were, as it were, two parties, actors, Corypheus, and the audience, one can make this ceremonial of direct, living participation a specific kind of reciprocity, a direct, open, liberated and authentic reaction." Lloyd Favell, justifying the combination of ritual theater, recalls, "As an indigenous person, I grew up in the worldview of my parents and grandparents. It was a mystical, lively world full of magical stories, so it shaped my aesthetic right away. Much like the paintings by Chagall, on which he painted the stories and pictures of his childhood, my work and subjects are in many ways similar to the Chagall's journey of memories. Art and ritual are two different disciplines, but of course they can interpenetrate. The ritual needs faith in the spiritual dimension to take place, and faith is very difficult in this period of life. Faith is viewed as an old-fashioned and has to do with religion, but in our Cree worldview, belief is trust in the unknown and the wonders of the Great Spirit and His creation. The song, music, and moments in the ritual are aimed at the unknown, while in the theater, all directions are aimed at the audience. The place where theater and ritual meet is an action, and there they meet in a different dimension. We believe that we live in a multi-dimensional universe, and when we remember it, we begin to see that theater itself can thus have its own power. Both concepts of a return to ritual assume participation through action, movement, and multidimensionality. During the work attended by inter alia representative of Indigenous people, Floyd Favell, in the first part of the workshop, presented his work method with the definition he created. Family, healing, theater multiplied by process, which create doubled theater. Explaining the meaning of his definition, he claims that the foundation of his concept of theater is the family, or FA. As indigenous people, the family is the basis of our culture. Each person is a husband, brother, wife, grandfather, child, and so on. We are not like non-native people, where art comes from a lonely, neurotic person with no connection to family and culture. Family is the basis of theater, and this is healing. That is age, because theater must have a healing function, and in our case it is healing from the traumatic effects of colonization, and this should lead to a form of liberation over time. The source of his theater is indicated by tradition, language, images, methods, and techniques that double the entire process of creating the theater. It means theater multiplied by process. Here Favell emphasizes his relationship with Grotowski, who in the last period of his work will write, "When I refer to the ritual, I'm talking about objectively. It means that the elements of the action are instruments of work on the body, heart, and head of those who act. We work with songs, impulses, forms of movement, and there may even be narrative themes." According to Floyd, all this creates a double theater, that is TH2 theater, doubled, in contact with the spiritual dimension of life, as proposed in this book by Antonin Artaud, Theater and its Double. The next days of stay at the workshops are spent on getting to know the culture of indigenous people. Numerous meetings, participation in ceremonies, getting to know the songs as an extraordinary experience for me, a spiritual experience, and above all, I'm grateful for the kind of trust that the residents of the reserve, headed by Floyd, have placed in me. Thank you very much, and I'm grateful. So I asked the director if it's important for him to use ceremonies and indigenous culture to create theater. Yes, very much, because this is the land where my ancestors lived, and the ancestors are very important to the people of the Cree. They guide us, and we always remember and pay tribute to our ancestors. We also pay tribute to our ceremonies, so it's natural that this aspect of our culture manifests itself in our art. My entire theatrical journey, my current search for theater by the lake is based on the dream of my ancestors who told me to build a theater in the middle of nowhere, far from the big city. The theater that we are trying to build is not an imitation of colonial theater, but our own native theater, in its own world and natural environment, and with our own building material. Indigenous theater should not be based on identity, because identity today is such a fluid colonial concept. Rather, one of the main factors in native theater should be language, music, rhythm, methods, and techniques derived from their rituals and social structures, and that indigenous theater is open to all people and it's not limited or defined by identity. Identity has led us to a dead end, and I believe in theater, like other colonial concepts in Canada, has led our people to a dead end. If, according to Floyd's concept, theater should be based on native culture and tradition, its own rituals and stories, why is Antoni Chekhov's text Uncle Vanya chosen by him as a workshop during his work? I asked myself this question much earlier, in the preparation phase for the expedition, when Floyd sends the material to work during the workshop. I've been dealing with this topic for a long time. When traveling from the Vancouver to Reserve, I read and analyzed the text. I come to the conclusion that there is some kind of similarity between the prairies of Canada and the steppes of Russia, between the silence, stillness, apparent peace of these lands. Floyd answers my question. In Uncle Vanya, I wanted to break down the show into its core images and action. Pictographs, which are narrative visual images that the Plains Indians used to capture and remember important events. I wanted to use the native method to break down the script and create a workflow. This core process becomes the gateway to our worldview, our view that contact us to creation. I'm interested in history because of the basis of our culture is storytelling, so history is very important to me. In my opinion, this is another similarity with Jerzy Grotowski, who over the years of the theatrical work deals with the classic text, staging, among others, Faust, Dziady, Kordian. While still working in the Stary Teatr in 1959, he also directed Uncle Vanya. Another important link between the work of Floyd Favel and his teacher Jerzy Grotowski is the attempt to build a community around the theater they create. In Grotowski's work, especially in the last period of his work at Poundmaker, he points to the importance of collective life, community, opening the perspective of the future of the world by working on establishing new types of interpersonal bonds while maintaining the truth about inalienable nature of individualism and the antagonistic properties of the real world of differences. The level of community bond that performers achieve through the perfection of collective singing and physical activities is extremely high, wrote Igor Rostok-Fiszewski, describing the work of the final stage by Jerzy Grotowski. Looking at the work of Floyd Favel and participating in the workshops, I have the impression that the community is which I'm only a guest is my home. Favel builds a group around himself that, by performing common songs, participating in rituals, goes beyond the framework of a traditional family, creating very strong relationships that have not strength to recreate its culture. Favel himself claims that he does not build a community around theater, because theater is part of the community. Theater that comes from the community and its own land base. The little scraps of land we now occupy, 2% of Canada's land mass, is the last place in which may be free from colonial influence. They can be places of freedom to preserve their own language and culture, but they can also be open-air prisons, which was their original intention when the reservation system was imposed on us in 1876. This strength of the community is proof of determination and desires from the culture of the First Nations in Canada to survive, and theater itself as a tool can help in this process. Our workshop in 2018 and 2019 ended with a post-workshop show. In 2018, the show was organized outside the reserve. I think that the power of the show in 2019, which took place in the reserve, was much greater. I remember when the townspeople came to see the performance, they created kind of community almost like family. Conversations, meeting relatives, all to see the work of his brother Floyd Favel. As a theater director and organizer of such activities, I know how much effort and work it is. Organizing an event of international importance, organizing people, places, all to rebuild the culture. When I ask Floyd why he does it, he replies, "My theater is largely an extension of my life. I don't have a theater life separate from my personal and ritual life. I would say that my theater is ritual art because I found many answers in ritual. This is sacred art. So my life revolves around the idea of theater as well as practically, building real buildings as well as performative and ritual spaces. I also include ceremony in my process, and the ritual connects us to our spiritual worlds. Thank you for meeting you, Floyd Favel. Thank you, Professor Eugenia Sojka and Professor Dorota Fox, as well as all friends from beyond the Great Water. Thank you for letting me be with you for a moment.